Guys, Jerry inspired. This is the pastor to the church that I go to, Pastor Mark Adams. Welcome, Pastor.
Good to be here, Jerry.
Tell me about your childhood. Did you grow up with a lot of religion? Did you grow up in a more secular household? How was your childhood?
Well, my dad was a pastor for 50 years, so we definitely grew up in a Christian home. Was born in Louisville, Kentucky while he was at seminary. And interesting enough, our son was born in Louisville while I was attending seminary.
Wow.
So that's kind of cool. But yeah, I grew up in a good Christian home.
That's cool. So growing up, you must have sometimes, in fact, probably most of the time, been there while he was preaching.
Yep. In fact, when I got a little older, the church Dad was at had an 8:30 service and 11 o'clock service. So on Saturday nights when my siblings are watching TV, Dad would call me up to his study and he wanted to read his sermon to me to see how it sounded. And so I'd listen to him Saturday night, and then I went with him at 8:30 to help him. So I heard it at 8:30, and then I heard it at 11 too. So I heard his sermons 3 times every week for years.
Wow, that is so interesting. Did you notice tweaks the second time he gave the sermon during the Sunday?
I don't remember now, but if I'd been older and taken notes, I probably would have noticed some tweaks.
That's so cool. And then, was the community you grew up with a fairly Christian community?
Yes. The church, our lives revolved around the church. So all of our friends were from the church my dad pastored pretty much. And friends who stick closer than a brother or a sister, really close friendships.
When you decided, okay, it's time to go to the higher education, was seminary the thing you always wanted to do, or is it something later?
No, it was later. When I started college, I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be rich, like F. Lee Bailey. You may not remember him. And I majored in political science, but that just didn't ring my bell. I just felt like it wasn't right. And so I changed my major to accounting. And I tried that for a while, but that didn't ring my bell. And about that time, I was active in Baptist Student Union on my campus. And my BSU director asked me to go to this little church out in the hills of Alabama and lead their singing for a week. So I went, I led their singing, and they asked me to come back and do it again. And I did. And then they said, would I like the job permanently, which would be part-time, they were going to pay me $30 a week. And I said no, because I was going to a big church in Florence, Alabama, for the first time in my life. And I was having a good time. And I didn't want to go to some podunk church. So I said no. But when I said no, it was like a buzzer went off in my head, like, wrong answer. And I really struggled with it until I realized that's what God was calling me to do, to be a minister. So I served at that church for about 3 years or so as their minister of music, and I worked with the teenagers too.
What was the process like once you realized, okay, God calling you to go to that church? Did you have to call, or did you have to meet up with the guy again who offered you a job? You're like, okay, it turns out I want it. What was that process like?
I just called him back and said, I felt like God wants me to say yes. Are you still interested? And they said, sure. And they were wonderful, patient people, helping me to learn a lot about ministry. And I changed my major to music because back then I didn't feel called as a pastor, and to be on a staff member, you had to be a minister of music and some other combination like music and youth. And I did that for 25 years.
Wow. Wow. That's so interesting also in college, how you change your majors too. That's the common process nowadays, right? But probably back then when you went to college, it wasn't as prevalent to be a guy to be like, oh, and I'm going to do that, right?
Right. That's true. It wasn't that prevalent. And because I did, I squeezed a 4-year degree into 5.
I love how you said it. You squeezed a 4-year degree into 5. Wow. Okay. So you did how was it like working with the teens?
It was fun. I love working with teens because you could see that in the years you worked with them, you had them for 6 years, from 7th grade till high school graduation. You could see a change. You could see them growing in the Lord, many of them. And that was rewarding to see that you were making a difference in kids' lives.
What type of church was this, by the way?
It was a Baptist church.
Oh, Baptist. Okay, so the same type of church you're at now. That makes sense. So the music selection process was fairly streamlined, right?
Yeah, back then, when I first started, I mean, it was just like you pick 3 or 4 hymns for the service, and then you pick a choir special. Didn't necessarily have to go with a sermon or anything, you know. Um, uh, Funny, I used to, my first few practices with the choir, I just pull out 5 or 6 pieces and we'd practice, and whatever sounded best, we'd sing the next Sunday. But I learned quickly that doesn't work. You got to plan more out in the future than that. So I had to I had to do a lot more planning than just whatever sounds good, you know. And then in later years, I learned the importance of working with the pastor to make sure that my music helped prepare the people for the message of his sermon. So, you know, I try to pick songs that fit with what he was preaching on and things like that.
That makes sense. And to clarify, the reason why doing rehearsing and then picking what sounds good didn't work in the long run was because you'd run out of songs, right? Is that why?
Exactly. And maybe nothing would sound good. And you know, so I had to, you know, like I had to be thinking, okay, I need to get more music. I need to plan, you know, music that the choir can do. You know, I got to plan out in advance a couple months. So that kind of thing doesn't happen.
Do Baptist churches usually use like a unified hymn book?
Well, in those days they did. It just the hymnal was all. Of course, you know, as years went on, praise choruses became popular, and that was brought into it and everything, and so that changed. Sadly, toward the end of my minister music days, there were things called music wars, where churches would actually split over the style of music. Some churches wanted to stay with just hymns, others wanted to be more contemporary, and sadly, a lot of churches split because of that.
That part of history is so interesting, and it's something that I think people who I found Christ later on in my life, so I didn't grow up with the church. So like if I grew up with the church, I probably would have seen some of this, but like these are things that fascinate me. But then as you get more into walking the path of a Christian, you start understanding, because the message is very important, and music is very important. So yeah, for anyone watching who can't fathom this, just think about the thing you care the most about. Like how much would you defend or argue about that, right? A lot. So that's the analogy I would give to people. Wow. So where did your church fall in that little like music war?
Toward the end, you know, as I learned and stuff and went to seminary thing, I learned to blend and do both, you know, do a good blend of contemporary and hymns. And I think it's important to sing new songs, because God is always doing new things. His mercies are new every morning. So we shouldn't be stuck in the same songs all the time. It's good to teach them new songs, but it's also good to, you know, to remember the old songs and the solid, neat doctrine that they have. One thing I like about Wildwood is I'm always every Sunday I learn a new song. I mean, they always have new songs I've never heard before, which is kind of cool.
I love what you said about finding that balance, because again, it's not like God stopped talking to musicians in like the 1800s, right? So
right, exactly. Plus, you don't want to get into rote habit of singing songs you don't even think about what you're singing anymore. You know, you want to be challenged in your Christian growth with the music.
Yeah, that is something I've talked to Pastor Mark privately about, because how much of our lives in general do we just get into these rote habits of like, we'll just repeat statements we'll hear on TV or hear in movies, or we'll sing something that once we look at the lyrics, we're like, right? So you have to be consciously aware of the lyrics, and also the melody, the harmony, everything that comes together as music. You have to be aware of what it all means.
That's right. That's right. That's right, Jerry.
And was part of the reason you went to seminary because of all the sort of splits that was happening, or did you always want to go to seminary?
No, I always wanted to go to seminary, and I always wanted to go to Southern because my dad did. And so that's where I went. Now I started in church music, but then I realized, you know, I'm going to be doing music in youth. I'm going to need more theology. So I changed my degree to a Master's of Divinity, and to give more of a balance. So I'd had music for college, and and theological training for seminary.
What is the process like to apply to seminary? Or do you just kind of apply and get in? There's not like, oh, you have to take tests and stuff like that.
Well, you do have to send in your college transcripts. I think pretty much everybody applies, gets in. I don't know. I do know, I thought it was interesting when I got there. One of the tests you take as you begin is an English proficiency test. And a big chunk of seminary freshmen or students had to retake English because they were not good at they had not done good in their studies in college when it came to English. And if you're writing a sermon or a newsletter article or a letter, you got to know English. You got to get that right. Fortunately, I passed my English proficiency test, so I didn't have to retake remedial English.
Very funny, because as a parallel, a lot of undergraduate schools, even when I went to college, the one required class was either a writing class or an essay writing class.
Exactly.
So it looks like Americans in general, the American education system has for decades been unable to teach our primary language well.
That's true. It's sad, but true.
And that also makes sense why part of why we listen to pastors is their ability to write, their ability to articulate, their ability to express. So they have to be very well trained on the English language.
That's true. That's right.
So what was the day in the life like during seminary?
You'd get up early. We only had one car, so I biked to seminary. We lived about 2-3 miles off campus, and I biked to seminary. So you have classes, usually took my lunch, have a lunch break, get home around, I don't know, 3 or 4, and, say hi to Sue and get ready for dinner and then study. And there was a lot of studying at seminary. They call your first semester of Greek, they call it baby Greek because it keeps you up all night like a baby does. You're up all night studying, In fact, they had little pyramid-shaped concrete pylons that lined the circular driveway of the main building of seminary. And we always said those were monuments to kids who flunked out of baby Greek because it was so hard. You had to study all the time.
Is it just because the language of Greek is hard, or is it more Greek applied to the biblical interpretations?
You're learning Greek to be able to translate scripture, the New Testament. So it's applied to the biblical tradition, but it is hard. It's hard to learn a new language. Greek was a lot easier than Hebrew. For example, for Greek, my final exam was to be able to translate the book of Philippians. But for Hebrew, my final exam was to translate one verse, and it took the whole 2 hours of the exam to do that. It's just so much more difficult. But and it's been so long, I've forgotten almost all. But I really love those studies because they help me to understand the scriptures better.
For those of you who've never heard Pastor Mark preach, he loves to sometimes talk about, oh, this is what it means in Greek. This is what, and also you're pulling from all those years ago from seminary.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Wow. So you had to learn Hebrew, Greek. Did you have to learn Latin too?
No, but I took Latin in high school. So that helps me a lot. I had all 4 years of high school at Latin.
I see. So Greek and Hebrew. And then obviously there were divinity classes too. There were classes on literature probably.
Yeah, there are classes like you had Old Testament survey, New Testament survey. You'd have classes like the philosophy of the religion. You'd have classes on church administration. There'd be classes on like books of the Bible, like a study of the book of Romans, like that kind of thing. All kinds. It's a full 16-hour load every semester, and there's a lot of studying, but we loved it. We had a good time. I love my teachers, and my classmates are just been best friends. I still have friends, nearly 50 years ago that we met in seminary, and we're so close.
Wow, that's amazing. And what is the breakdown of the people after they graduate? Do 80% become pastors, or is it even more than that?
The campus has a master's in church music program. So those people go into church music, and then they have the divinity school. So those people probably most of them go into the pastorate. A lot go into youth ministry or children's ministry, things like that.
And so at this point, you're already married. You were married to Sue already.
We married in August 14th, and we started seminary 2 weeks later. So we basically went on our honeymoon and then moved to Louisville. So,
Wow. Wow. Um, so you went to seminary school. What was the plan afterwards? Did you already have something lined up afterwards?
no, I had a church during seminary. During seminary, you're required to have at least 1 year of experience in a congregation, and you're supervised by a faculty member. And you write reports and you meet with him, that sort of thing. So you have to have a church at least sometime. But because there's like 3,000 people looking for a church in the Louisville area, a lot of times you had to go a long way to get a church. So some people, that's why they did not have seminary classes on Monday, because a lot of people were driving back from their church field where they'd live for the weekend. I was blessed because I had a church just across the river in the New Albany, Indiana. And it was good to have it close because we were able to do more. We didn't just go on weekends. I worked with youth on Wednesdays and Sundays. We had youth events and things like that. And so that was a blessing for me. And what's even better is my supervisor in ministry was my pastor. He was on the faculty at seminary. So we had a good time in doing that together for those years.
I see. Were there any challenges that you had to overcome during those days?
Well, it's always hard to make ends meet. I mean, I made a little bit at the church, I think 125 a week, although our apartment rent was 85 a month when we first started. And by the time I graduated, I think it had gone up to 125. So, but finances are a stress. Sue worked in order to help us have enough to get by. Um, Studying is a stress. You're always trying to get work done. I had one professor who required a paper every week, which we always thought was not fair because, we had other professors that gave us work too. But that's a stress. But overall, it was just a wonderful experience. I grew in the Lord, and we made great friends and great memories, and our marriage was stronger. We grew strong, had a good foundation then. We didn't have children. It was just both of us. There were seminarians with children, but I don't know how they did it because you don't have any extra time, and kids take time. But anyhow, it was wonderful 3 years. We had a good time there. In fact, we stayed at that church another year full time after I graduated.
What made you move on from that church, or was it just the natural next process, next stage?
Well, a church in Damascus, Maryland contacted us, and it was a church my dad had started when he was a young pastor, and we prayed about it, and we felt God was calling us to go there. So we went there. It was just, a lot of prayer and decision. That's what God wants us to do, and so we did.
I see. And that was the church you were the pastor at for many, many years.
No, I'm getting ahead of no, I was minister of music youth there, and eventually came to Redland, where I was minister of youth for 7 years. And then at 96, I guess, 95, the pastor left to take another church. And then the minister of education left, and the children's minister left. So that all were left as far as clergy was me and the music person. And the search committee asked me first if I wanted my name in the hat to be pastor. And I said, no, I love working with youth. That's all I want to do. And they said, well, would you be like the acting senior? You don't have to preach on weekends. Just, we need someone to be in charge during the week. And I said, okay, I'll do that. And so I did that for 2 years. And during those 2 years, I did a lot of funerals and weddings, and I preached a lot more than I had in the past. And anyhow, one day I was in staff meeting, and I got a phone call, and the quickest place to get to a phone was the pastor's office. So I just ran in there and took the call. And while I was sitting in the chair, the pastor's chair, I felt like God saying, I want you to sit in this chair all the time. And I said, no, God, I'm not interested in that. And and we bargained. You don't bargain with God, but I said, okay, but it have to be the search committee's idea. And I thought that was safe because I already told him no. But that, like within less than a week, they called me and said, would you reconsider? Would you consider being our pastor? And Sue and I struggled with that for weeks. We prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. And finally, we felt like that's what God wanted us to do. And so I became the pastor, and I served as pastor for a little over 25 years at Redland, and then retired about 2 years ago.
It's a common theme that every person goes through. It's like we want to run from God's guidance, or we want to bargain. How did you learn to kind of recognize those feelings? Okay, am I sort of going against God, or like how do you learn to recognize that?
Well, I think for me, it's a feeling of unrest, like I'm pushing against something I'm not supposed to do. Like this is not right. You just a feeling that I'd made the wrong decision, and then in praying, we began to feel peace with the decision to become pastor. And we laid out fleeces for him in different ways, and he always honored that. And then I also know it was the right decision because he helped me to be a good pastor, and he taught me, and those people were patient with me too. I had to, I learned, you don't just preach, you also have to lead church council meetings, you have to do counseling, you have to run business meetings. One thing I remember thinking is I wish seminary had more practical training, like how to do a baptism, how to lead Lord's Supper, how to run a meeting, that kind of thing. But so you had to kind of learn that on the fly. And the people are very patient with me and waiting for me to kind of get up to speed.
I'm glad you talked about the behind the scenes, because I think a lot of people who go to church don't realize that the pastor has to do so much. The pastor has to wear multiple hats. He's not just the person preaching. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. I will tell you personally, I went to a church in LA where it was a good pastor. I mean, I don't think any church attendees who weren't involved in the administrative aspects had any issues with it, but apparently behind the scenes, because he had never been trained with the business stuff either. So he never meshed with them. And in fact, he even said he himself was probably guilty of doing certain things that didn't help the church. But it's just like the funny thing you said about seminary school, I think people who go to any sort of non-seminary school have the same thing. It's like, why don't they teach us all these like things that should be like 101 for life?
Exactly.
When in that journey as the head pastor, the lead pastor, did you finally feel like, okay, I think I'm starting to get a handle on this?
I don't know if I ever felt I had a complete handle on it, but I think in a few years I began to get more comfortable with it, and things. I began to learn how to minister to people in grief, and how to do graveside services, and how to make a church council meeting more efficient, and things like that. One of the things Redland always did, and they'd done before I came, they'd done before I came. Before I came, the pastor had always done a state of the church sermon in January. Like, this is how things are going. And this is where we think we're going in the future. And I did that, but I called it a vision sermon. So every year I would pray like about 3 months before the new year and thinking, God, where are we going? What are you calling us to do this year? And then I'd meet with staff and church council. We go on a retreat and we'd talk about it, and we'd get excited about it, and we start planning it. And then I would have a sermon in January to say, okay, here's what we're going to be doing this year. And that helped in sermon planning and church council planning and event planning. Does it line in with the vision? That sort of thing.
Throughout your years in this field, have you seen kind of church attendance go up, go down? Has it fluctuated? What have you noticed about that?
Well, I think overall church attendance has gone down. I even noticed that at Redland. Probably year 13 or 14, we began to slow in our growth. And of course, COVID hit, and that didn't help. We had a lot of people who didn't return after the lockdown. But even the churches I've served in since I retired, I've done a lot of pulpit supply, and Wildwood is my second interim. But most of the churches I've supplied in are small, and that used to be big. I mean, huge sanctuaries with maybe 50 people, most of them with very gray hair, no children's ministry, no youth ministry. Just kind of sad, you know. And I think a lot of people just have turned away from the institutional church. One thing I think is good about that, because God works in all things for his glory, is there's been kind of an increase in small group Bible studies and small churches. Like Francis Chan is a big leader of this. And I like it because I think it's in small groups that you really begin to get to know other Christians, and you feel comfortable enough to encourage one another to spiritual growth and admonish one another when you're not on the right road. And you get more passionate about evangelism. If you're in a big group of people, it's easy just to come on Sunday and go home, and that's not it. But when you're in a smaller group, people are holding you accountable to live out your faith all the time. So I think God is using that. I think that's going to be kind of the church of the future, smaller and more streamlined.
I definitely have an anecdote to support that. So even though I didn't grow up Christian, I discovered Christianity pretty early. In the 90s, I had underground Christians that I hung out with.
Cool.
And so those people didn't have a church that I knew of. Maybe they did, but it was an underground church, right? It wasn't big. So, but I got exposed to the word of God very early, even though I didn't become a Christian until much later in my life. But like, that's an example of, look at that. It's little groups. You know, I had a friend, he was a very good Christian in China, and he was my friend. He was almost like my bigger brother, right?
Yeah.
That was his role in my life. And I thank him. Like, if you think about my journey towards Christ, he was definitely a big part of it. And think about what it took for him to stay with his faith, right? Sometimes through a lot of these external things that try to stop him, it makes his faith stronger.
Exactly. And I remember, thinking of my youth ministry days, there were guys who would brag about how big their youth group was. And I would always think, well, getting a big youth group is not really hard. Just get a bunch of pizza and Coke, and, you'll have a bunch of kids. But, the group gets smaller if you say, okay, we're going to actually study the Bible, and I'm going to expect you to live out its teachings. And we're going to, then you have a smaller group, but I think you have like a better group. You can be a mile wide and an inch deep, or you can be like, 100 yards wide and several feet deep. And that's, I think, what real church is.
Yeah, I think I am definitely on the same page on that, especially in LA. I think I would say I had the privilege of going to a lot of different types of churches to compare. And the way I would describe a lot of the preachings at bigger churches, so you mentioned a mile wide, and you said, what is it called, a feet deep, or
an inch deep?
Oh, yeah. An inch deep. I noticed a third category, which is a mile wide and a mile deep, but not in the right places.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, you can have a huge congregation, you can have lots of money coming in, you can have all these big ministries, and not really be reaching the lost and growing the saved. I think that's one reason God called me out of that big church in Alabama I was going to serve in that little church.
That makes sense.
Because it's not about numbers, it's about people. And the individual is quickly lost in big numbers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I will personally say I've never had an experience like I've had at Wildwood. And, I give all the credit to the church and Pastor Mark. It's just like, it's a different experience every time. First of all, one of the things I love about Wildwood is that we're actually very deeply exploring passages, especially uncomfortable passages sometimes in the Bible, right? A lot of the bigger churches will try to cater towards the broads, and the safe passages, the fun passages. But no, sometimes, like, I remember that the first time, I think you were preaching that day, we went through Revelations, which I've never read through with a pastor before. We went through like the first few little sentences. I was like, this is great. Nobody wants to talk about Revelation. I want to hear about Revelations from a pastor's view. I was like, that's the type of church I want to go to.
You may remember on Sunday I said I won't say his name, but there's a famous pastor who years ago decided, we're not going to study the Old Testament anymore. We're just going to study the New. And when I first thought of that, I thought, you're lazy. You don't want to explain how the Old Testament and the New go together. You don't want to do the work of studying the background and realizing that the New is not complete without the Old, and vice versa. So yeah, you have to study the whole Bible. Another thing I noticed about the megachurch movement is, if you got a big church and you got a majorly famous pastor, you're relying on him to keep the crowds coming and keep the money coming in. So if you mess up as a megachurch pastor, the board, the deacons, whatever you call them, are more likely to say, okay, let's just cover that up because we don't want to lose our cash draw, And we've seen that happen so many times in megachurch pastors, and it's so sad. These guys that we set up as like heroes of the faith and people we wanted to emulate, and we found out later they were, just living sinful lives, which just really broke my heart and hurt a lot of people.
Anyone that has a Netflix account has seen some of those documentaries, man. Yeah, they are heartbreaking because some of those churches are like pretty worldwide. They're like not just mega, like when you think American mega churches, they're like international mega churches.
Exactly.
What evolved in your preaching as you were at Redland, or we can even expand it? What evolved in your preaching throughout all these years?
I learned it takes a long time to prepare a sermon. I remember thinking back to my dad's example. He was always studying, and he brought books on vacation. He was always studying, and I remember as a kid thinking, "Gosh, why aren't you more able to do things with us?" But when I became a pastor, I understood it takes a lot of time. It takes about 30 hours to prepare a 30-minute message. So about an hour of study for a minute of preaching. So I learned it took a long time. So that I learned I had to plan ahead. I had to, and that's where the vision came in, because I knew here's the topic I need to aim at. So what's some books of the Bible I could look at to make that work? What's some subjects I could dig in the scriptures to uncover? And so that helped me to plan my sermons out about 6 months ahead. And then that would give me time to be gathering resources ahead of time for those sermon series. And then I came into a plan. I would I'd come home Sunday, I'd take a nap, and then I'd spend about 4 hours reading all the resources for the next week's sermon and taking notes. And I wouldn't go to bed until I had a rough outline of the sermon. Then Monday, I would begin to flesh out that outline. Tuesday, I would do more. Wednesday, I'd start working on the PowerPoint. It was like I do a certain number of hours every day. I wouldn't try to finish the sermon in one day. I try to get this much done this day. That took away the stress too, because I realized I just got to do this part today and that part tomorrow. Then I learned that sets of commentaries aren't near as valuable as individual commentaries, like Swindoll's commentary on the book of Luke would be better than a whole set of commentaries. It was more focused, more intense. I learned that was a better source. I learned to use preaching resources like Preaching Today, where you can get not only sermons to get ideas from, you can also get they have 5,000 illustrations in a database where you can look for them according to scripture or subject. That really helped. And I remember thinking, Dad never had that. He never had the internet or even a computer. So I guess those are the things I learned to look at. And I also learned it's good to bring your congregation into your sermons. Like I would find people who would share testimonies as illustrations on a sermon I was preaching, or I would do a survey of the congregation to find out things like if I was doing a sermon on marriage, I do a survey in the congregation for a couple of weeks on marriage, and then I'd ask permission and share quotes. And and here's a way to prove this point. So and so said this.
One of the great things that you talked about is just being able to break down the workload. That is so important. And that just, they've been trying to teach the majority of us that since probably middle school, but how many of us really learn? It's funny about procrastination, because the more people study procrastination, the more they realize it's not just procrastination. A lot of times procrastination is almost like a trauma response.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is, getting a little off topic. And that's something potentially that people in education, people in whatever, need to study more. But yeah, how do you break from the procrastination thing? And it's like, the way you're able to kind of break it up and everything. I mean, part of it is you obviously love what you do, right? And so,
Yeah.
like, if you tell someone to do something they don't love doing, they're gonna probably procrastinate. That's just part of life. But the fact you love what you do and you feel God, talking to you, that is itself gonna probably reduce a lot of the sort of bad habits we all learned from school.
Exactly. Yeah. For me, it was like necessity is the mother of invention. I think like 3 weeks into being a pastor, I realized, gosh, I got to prepare a sermon every week. And so I realized I got a plan. I got to cut this up into biteable pieces,
Maybe that's the way, as just people in society, how we can teach younger people, kids, how to learn to not procrastinate. Start teaching these skills on something they love, like figure out what they love and teach them to break it down to biteable pieces. I don't know if they ever did that with us when we were in school. I don't remember.
Yeah, I know. I that's important. I know. I can't do it all the last time. Although I did learn in seminary that the best way to prepare for an exam was I have all my notes ready. And then I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'd study them for like 4 hours, then go take the test. That would help me. But that's not always the best way to do it. You really should be doing it all along. I remember I had one seminary professor who allowed us to make a cheat sheet. He said, you can make a cheat sheet, one paper, 8.5 by 11, front and back. But by the time I organized my material so it would fit on a piece of paper, I'd already learned it. I didn't need the paper anymore. So I thought that was a good teaching lesson he gave us.
And then there's some people, I remember I had one of those classes where you could make a cheat sheet, but I didn't learn the material. So the cheat sheet didn't matter, right? So yeah, it either helped you learn the material, or if you wanted to rely on it, good luck.
Yeah.
Have any of the kids of you or your grandkids want to follow in your footsteps?
Well, not really. My son's a doctor. My middle daughter is a photographer. But our youngest daughter, she's a physical therapist. She went to grad school and all. But when she got married, she and her husband decided to get involved in a ministry called Apartment Life. So they live in an apartment complex, and their job is to host activities 3 or 4 times a month through which they can build relationships that hopefully lead to gospel conversations. And they've been doing that for over a year, and they really love it. It's so in a sense, in a real sense, she's in ministry. Both my other kids are in ministry too, but they're just not paid to do it. And that's one thing I tried to explain to my congregation, is that all of us are called to full-time ministry as Christians. My job as a pastor is to equip you to do it. But you're a minister, whether you're a plumber or a physician or a lawyer or a carpenter or a housewife or whatever. You're to be being salt and light in the world wherever you go. That's the whole reason we meet to worship and study the Bible on Sundays, is to prepare you to minister.
And I actually just wrote down Apartment Life as you talked about. I never knew that existed. That is such a cool program.
It is, and they have it all over the country. I'm proud of Becca and her husband Andrew. They've built really good relationships with the people they minister to. Everybody knows them, and they've started taking several of them to church with them on Sundays, and they've branched out to where Friday they have a prayer and pizza night a couple times a month, just to come pray with us. She has like a coffee thing every Friday for anybody who wants to just bring their coffee and meet in the club room and pray and talk. They're doing a really cool ministry there.
Oh, this is really great. Wow. This is something that if I knew about in LA, I would have totally signed up for. This is wow.
Me too. I would love to do that. Maybe if the Lord keeps me alive long enough, my wife and I'll do that someday.
That makes sense. So Sue, during this whole process, your wife, how has she supported you?
Well, she's been the best pastor's wife in the world, and praying for me. And she's been so patient when I've had to study a long time during the day, and when I've had to, there's been an emergency, I have to leave, and she has to take care of the kids and cook and stuff. She's been a real supporter. She's also been a great example too. She started a ladies' Bible study at Redland on Tuesdays that just grew and grew and grew, and they still have it. It's very, very popular and did really well. She taught youth and Sunday school. When I was a youth guy, she went on every youth event with us. Sorry, just a spam phone call. She just did ministry like we would have like the deacons Christmas dinner at our house every year, and she would work so hard for like 6 weeks to get ready for that. And she was always glad to host people in her home, and she was such a great supporter, and now that I'm retired, she's working not full-time, but almost in a thrift store ministry at Redland. She runs a thrift store, and it's real front lines ministry with people in need. It's really cool. They do a food pantry as well.
Another very interesting part about being a Christian and just church in general, the service aspect of it, right? And this is something that I don't think I've done too much since becoming Christian. The option was always there, especially in LA, right? They love doing this stuff, but the option was always there. But I don't know if I've never been called to do it. I guess it's one of those things. I guess when the time comes, I'll do it. But what percentage of Christians that go to church like do these kind of more service-based things?
It's a good question. Probably at different churches are different. I think Redland's a pretty big majority do that. I know them well enough to know that how many people are involved in all the various ministries. Used to be we had like maybe 80% doing that, and the churches I've filled in, and since I retired, it's the same thing. I mean, at Wildwood, pretty much everybody does something, and the church I served in, Sunset Beach, same thing. Everybody did something. Everybody was on 2-3 committees and that sort of thing. But I've also seen people who really took it out into the world. We had one guy at Redland who worked for the Metro, the subway, and he started a Bible study in his shop, and still does it to this day. And other guys have done that too, which I thought been really, really cool. And then I've seen other people who've ministered to their neighbors and learned and share the love of Jesus with them. We had this one family who were military, and interesting enough, they were at Bethesda, and then were here at Redland for like 3 or 4 years, transferred out, came back 3 or 4 years later. They came back 3 times. The military transferred them around. Every time they did, they were doing nothing but bringing people to the church and sharing their faith with people who were baptized and became active and growing Christians. It was that kind of example was really, it wasn't as big as easy to find as I would like, but there were a lot of people like that.
The Christian message, where do you think it's struggling right now to reach people, if it is at all? I mean, because I think there's been a resurgence, especially in Gen Z. I think Gen Z's actually gotten more religious than definitely us millennials. But where do you think it sort of didn't reach us millennials / the young people that it's not reaching? Where do you think it went wrong, or / if I'm even phrasing it correctly?
No, I agree with you. I think it has gone wrong. And I think much of it, and I hate to be political, but I think much of it is because the world has begun to associate evangelical Christians with the legalism and the lack of compassion seen in the ultra-right conservative MAGA party, where instead of helping the immigrant, we're shipping them off to basically concentration camps, and where we're no longer paying for U.S. aid, which has done such wonderful work to help the hungry and the poverty stricken in our world, things like that. I think young people are turned off by that. They want to see a religion that really is a rubber meets the road religion, one that really does do what Jesus said we're supposed to do. And sadly, there've been a lot of Christians who haven't been behaving that way lately, and it's turned a lot of young people off. But I do agree with you. I think there's a hunger for God, and a lot of kids are reaching out in the right places. And I think that's where these small Bible studies and smaller churches are helping.
When I came back to America after the little stint in China, obviously it would have been very easy for me to, okay, let's start going to church because, I interacted with Christians, underground Christians in China. But
Wow.
I remember, I came back to America in the 2000s, right? And that was when the more radical elements on the right had sort of the public consciousness slash like the culture. And so I just remember that's what I associate Christians with. Oh, you're trying to like stop books from being read. Oh, or you're hating on this type of person. It's like, and I think that did turn me personally off from Christianity.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I know what you mean. And I even in LA, where LA's known to be like very left of center, or in general, Southern California known to be very left of center. Obviously, that's not the whole story, right? Even if let's say 60% of people in LA are very left of center, there's still like 40% of people on the right. But like sometimes I'd meet like Christians that I would consider conservative, and I'd be like, whoa, I had to stay away from them. Like, I'd rather interact with the lefty Christians than the right Christians. And I say that, and I'm conservative. I don't mind saying I'm a conservative, and I'm like, why are certain groups like making me uncomfortable, right? I think that's the same type of feeling you're trying to get at.
Yeah, I'm conservative too, but I believe that we should help the hungry and the poor and those in prison. And it seems like these days that's not popular in a lot of ultra conservative circles. They think, well, you're left, and I'm thinking, no, I'm trying to be biblical. So yeah, that kind of thing makes me sad. But I think young people really are hungry, and so I think this is opening for mature Christians. It's opening a door. We can show people, yeah, that's not what Christianity is like. Jesus told us to help people in need. People are important. You don't just cast them aside. You work to help people, and that gives you an opportunity to tell them about Jesus, and which is the best way to help people.
Even as a social media person, there are quite a lot of very popular Christian channels run by people in their 20s, man. So
Awesome.
yeah, I'm sure the majority of people that watch them are also people in their 20s. So it's a demonstration of the hunger slash there's people who are getting there.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. So let's see if there's any other topics you want to go. Do you have any topics you want to talk about?
One thing I've learned a lot since I've retired is how much I love the church. I mean, every little church we've been at, they're just wonderful people, and they're trying so hard to be Christ in the world. And it's kind of neat seeing how every church I go to, God has called people to do things that need doing. For example, when I was at Redland, our AV tech guy was a guy named Matt Jenkins, and he knew it all. And I've noticed every church I go to has sort of a Matt, an AV guy. And then, Sue's really someone who likes to do ministry to the needy and concrete ways. Every church I go to, there's a Sue. It just makes me love the church so much. I believe that it is the hope of the world. I mean, that's the body that is Jesus' body now, and we are his flesh. And the more we realize that, and do the things he would do, and say the things he would say, and love as he would love, the more we'll further his kingdom and bring more people into it.
I will add to that for those who sort of naturally stopped going to church after the pandemic, I think give it a shot again. Because I was in California at the time, so I was unhappy with a lot of how the church really didn't stand up to certain things. So I think I skipped church for, I think, almost 2 years. I mean, I tried once in a while to go to churches, but it wasn't like how I go to church now every Sunday. And I realize now I was missing a big part. Like you said, the church is the body of Christ. And I missed a lot of it. So for anyone that sort of fell off from going to church, I would encourage them to go back to church again, explore. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to go to a few churches before you find one like Wildwood, but keep going.
Amen. Christianity is like marriage. You can't do it alone. You need someone else. You need other Christians to help you grow. And some of the best ways I've grown is by looking at the example of other maturing believers, and that I wanted to emulate. So, yeah.
I 100% agree. And I think, Pastor Mark, this is a good stopping point for the first interview. Thank you so much.
No problem. Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Definitely. For viewers who see this, if you guys have any questions for Pastor Mark, please let us know in the comments. And I'm sure I'll do more conversations with Pastor Mark in the future.
Sounds
Awesome.
good.
Thank you guys so much.